Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be doodling some shells. I've done something like this in the past years ago and I wanted to create another version. I'm going to doodle this freehand and add things that I feel like adding, but I understand that this might make it a bit hard for you to see the shape, so I'm going to sketch it out for you as examples of the things I'm going to include. The easiest thing I feel you can add are mussel shells. I like to draw them out like this. It's a bit lopsided and they're kind of long. Sometimes I like to think of them as a little bit like comma shapes, but you can just make the bottom even if you'd like. I also like to add curved lines horizontally with many layers. With the same features, you can also make it look a bit more narrow and thin, or you can also make them wider. Now here as an example, this is what I meant by creating an even side on the left and right. You can also create something like this. Next, clamshells are very similar to this, but they're just much wider and they're usually fairly small. I'm also going to add the curved horizontal lines the same way I did with the mussels. Now this one is going to be a scallop shell. The ridges are going to go inwards towards the middle center of the shell instead, and the edges will be curved like this, so it's a little bit more complex. And I'm also going to add the auricle on the sides. Now I believe there are also clamshells like blood clams that kind of look like this as well, but there are no auricles on the sides and they're generally smaller. So here I'm just going to draw them out in different angles. So as you can see, by just changing the width or the direction of the details, you can create different types of shells. I feel like the addition of starfish would also look nice. I like to play with the length of the hands, or I googled this and apparently they're called the spines. You can make them short and stubby or long and wavy. There are also different shell types which are a bit more interesting. These are, I guess, cone-shaped ones. I kind of just tried to make things up as I go. I didn't really have a reference in front of me, and I just thought of a cone shape with many different patterns that I can paint on later. I also have a collection of shells that I use to decorate my photos for thumbnails and things, so I just tried to remember what I have in that collection without having it in front of me. But if you would like to include different ones, you can also look up for references beforehand and draw them out before painting them if you'd like. So these are just some ideas. I'm also going to include a dried up sea urchin later, and for extra decorative elements, if there are some odd spaces that you'd like to fill, you can also add some colorful corals. For this doodle, I'm going to use a variety of mediums, but the main one being watercolors, and here are the colors I'm going to use. This is Quin Sienna by Daniel Smith, Indigo by Schmincke, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, and Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm also going to use my Vtec gold palette. I'm only going to use this one, but you can also use other metallic paints. And I'm also going to use this dark brown colored pencil to create some doodles on top of the painting. This is just a cheap hobby grade one. You can use any colored pencils that you have. Now these are just the color combination that I've chosen for this doodle, but feel free to create other color combinations as well. You can maybe do something that looks more bright and fresh, like a combination of greens and blues, or deep blues and purples, or even pinks, reds, purples. Feel free to experiment. Part of the fun with these paintings is creating something that doesn't have to replicate nature, but it can be a bit more imaginative. For the first one here, I'm making the cone-shaped shell. I like to always start with a light color. This is from a mix of Buff Titanium and Yellow Ochre that I use as a base. And then while it's still damp, so I'm using the wet on wet process, I use a dark brown that is from a mix of Quin Sienna and Indigo to create the pattern and just letting it bloom on its own, which creates this fun texture. And I'm just going to let it dry for now and move on to the next one. For this next one, I want to create the scallop shell, And for this, I used the really dark brown mix. This time it has more indigo, which is why the color is more of a grayish tone. And I started with a very light consistency. Then around the edges, I use a thick consistency of indigo. Again, just painting it right next to the damp surface so the paint can travel naturally. For this next one, I'm going to create something similar to the cone shape but make it spiral. I'm using a light consistency of the grayish tone, but this time I added a little bit of yellow ochre, which is why the color is a bit grayish green. And as I got towards the bottom of the shell, I made the ovals larger. I also changed the color to just indigo, but I'm not going to move the paint around too much because I quite like the loose feel of the paint. Now with these color combinations, I'm just going to play around with the ratio to create different tones of blues, grays, greens, and browns. You can create your own combinations with these colors and use this opportunity to practice some color mixing and even play with different consistencies in order to create some nice contrasting values. The starfish is so fun to paint. I like to paint them as individual arms first and just as lines. Then you can thicken this however you'd like, or you can even make them wavy as you paint these lines. While these lines are still damp, I'm going to add a thick consistency of Quin Sienna on each end, and I'm going to smudge a bit of it towards the center so there's a nice gradual gradation. Then on the tips, I want to create more contrast, so I use the dark brown mix from Quin Sienna and Indigo. So from here on, I'm just going to create more of these elements with a combination of colors using the wet on wet technique, and just try to fill in the page with these limited colors and play with the ratio to create different consistent tones. This way, even if the tones or the colors are different for all of the shells, they're still going to be consistent and look like a collection or a set. What I'm trying to do here is basically to create a wet on wet base that I can doodle on top of with either watercolors or even other mediums. For the shape of the shell, sometimes we may run out of ideas, but say we don't want to add harder shapes. Just like mine, I want to keep things fairly simple. And if this is the case, you can always play with the length, size, and shape of, say, the basic mussel or clamshells or even starfish, just like how we sketched it out earlier. Or if you want to even do the same type of shells over and over again, you can create different variations from the color combination instead of the shapes, so they don't all look completely uniform to each other. I forgot to mention this earlier, but I try to fill in the page with larger shapes first as best as I can. Sometimes we may get ideas to paint smaller ones, and that's fine, but I just want the majority to be larger. This way, the large shapes will be distributed more evenly across the page, and this will also leave some odd spaces that we can then fill with smaller elements. As a tip, since we are working with a lot of wet on wet, Sometimes we may paint and certain areas may puddle. Like as an example here, you'll see a bit of paint puddling. And if that's the case, don't paint right on top of it straight away, but take off the excess puddle by using a dry brush before adding on any more details, or else the additional color will just move around the puddle instead of it being set on the paper and ready to bloom out on the damp surface. The more wet the paper, the faster the paint will bloom out and become more uncontrollable. So if it's still very cold to the touch, sometimes I like to use a hairdryer just to dry it ever so slightly before adding on any more paint. I think I'm getting there with the amount of elements I have on my page. However, I feel like around this starfish, it looks fairly empty compared to everything else because I feel like it's quite hard to fill in the area around the starfish with the really awkward spaces. They're fairly tiny too, so I decided to just add splatters. In this case, I'm controlling the so-called splatters by just drawing dots in different sizes. You can also do this in different colors as well. Once I'm done, I'm just going to use a hairdryer to make sure everything's completely bone dry because I'm going to paint more details on top. For the details, I'm going to use the same colors that's basically already on the base, and I'm going to paint on the ridges of some of these shells or even redefine certain patterns that I already painted as the base. If you'd like, you can even doodle something completely random right on top of these shells without adding the additional textures. Just enjoy the process and paint with your intuition. When I'm painting the clams and the mussels and adding on the textures, I intentionally made it a little bit messy. You can see that the lines are uneven and even the distances apart are quite different. They're not even and uniform. Personally, I feel like this gives a bit more character and a bit more looseness to the doodle, but it's completely up to you if you want to create something similar or something that looks a bit more neat and uniform. By the way, don't be scared or intimidated to play with darker values. It might look heavy on the eyes, but we can actually break up the shapes further by doodling with either white pen or even the bleed-proof white that I'm going to use later on. It actually looks nicer to doodle white on top of darker values. I'm not going to paint on top of every single one because some of them look fairly busy already. So now I'm going to move on to add some outlines to the lighter shells using my colored pencil. I'm just using this dark brown, but you can use other colors as well. For the smaller little shells, I actually prefer to use my colored pencil to add on the details instead of painting them. It's just so much easier this way and I don't have to control the load or anything. I'm just basically drawing on top of it. For the shell, I felt like the pattern looked too light, so I'm just painting over it using my colored pencil. And I'm also going to fill in some more spaces in between the shells by just doodling and drawing other shell types. Actually, when I was doing this, I wasn't really thinking, so some of them look really weird in my opinion, but it doesn't really matter. They're fairly small and it's not going to take away from the main design. By the way, you can also add these drawings or outlines using pens if you have any interesting colored pens. But personally, I always love the combination of watercolor and colored pencils together. I just love the texture of colored pencils. So I'm just sticking with what I have here. I feel like I have enough definition from the outline and everything is looking fairly dark, so I'm going to bring some brightness by adding some white details using bleed-proof white. As I mentioned earlier, you can also use white pen for this, but since I'm not going to draw anything with the bleed-proof white, I'm mostly painting dots. I'm just going to use my brush and a thick consistency paint. I was going to actually finish it off here, but I feel like gold will look nice with this color combination, so I decided to just add some gold circles in different sizes. You can also use a gold pen for this maybe. I feel like this just makes the overall composition look a little bit more fun and lively, but is completely optional. I'm basically done with all the elements, but for some reason I still feel like I can add some smaller elements in between some of the random spots. I was very close to feeling like this was overworked, but at the time I felt like it's a doodle anyway. I just want to paint whatever I feel like painting at the time. But yeah, after this tiny starfish, I'm going to add some smaller shells around the large starfish, and that's basically it for this tutorial. I personally enjoyed painting this one. It was very relaxing to me and I hope you feel the same. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!